Imagine this, a world teetering on the absolute edge of a massive war. Well, in April of 2026, that's exactly the situation we're diving into, with this fictional but scarily plausible crisis. We're talking about a conflict that spiraled out of control for 50 days, and then, just as it was about to go over the cliff, it just stopped. Or did it? Let's get into it.
So everything really came to a head on April 7th, 2026. President Donald Trump had given Iran a deadline, and with just hours left on the clock, he posted this, just a bone-chilling message on social media. The whole world just stopped and held its breath. Was he talking about a conventional war, or was this something way, way worse? A lot of people were pretty convinced a nuclear strike was on the table.
And then, the biggest plot twist you can imagine. Just 90 minutes, an hour and a half, before that deadline was set to expire, a ceasefire was announced. The world let out a collective sigh of relief, but everyone was left with this giant question mark. How in the world did we go from the brink of what looked like total annihilation to a sudden truce? That's the mystery we're going to try to unravel here.
Right, so this crisis didn't just pop up out of thin air. It was really the climax of a pretty devastating 50-day spiral that kicked off back on February 28th. First, let's just take a look at the devastating human cost of this thing escalating so fast.
The human toll was just staggering. In a little over 7 weeks, more than 4,000 people lost their lives. You know, it's one thing to see that number on a screen, but that represents thousands of families just completely shattered, and millions of lives turned upside down.
And you can see here, the fighting was just incredibly brutal in Iran and Lebanon. I mean, combined, you're looking at over 4,100 people killed. And then you see the numbers for Israeli and American soldiers, and wow, it really shows you just how asymmetrical this whole conflict was.
But this is where things got truly terrifying. The escalation started to involve Iran's nuclear program. You had attacks at the Natanz facility, and even more alarming, 4 separate bombings near the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Now put that in the context of a warning from Qatar just the year before. A direct hit could have caused a Chernobyl-level disaster. We're talking about contaminating the entire Gulf, making it uninhabitable for generations. Just unthinkable.
Okay, so from there, the conflict hits this massive turning point, an event that really challenged American claims of air superiority and kicked off this frantic, incredibly high-stakes rescue mission deep behind enemy lines. On April 3rd, it happened. An Iranian missile takes down a U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle. Now, this was a huge deal. President Trump had been talking about having total air dominance, but this proved that Iran's air defenses were very much still a real threat. And now, you've got 2 American crew members down on Iranian soil. The race against time was on. So how do they pull this off? Well, it was a pretty historic operation, really a textbook case of intelligence and special ops working together perfectly. First up, the CIA launched a deception campaign. They started spreading false news that both crew members were already safe, hoping it would get the Iranians to call off their search. Then, they managed to locate the second airman, who had brilliantly hidden himself up at a 7,000-foot altitude. From there, elite Delta Force and Navy SEAL teams slipped into Iran, while airstrikes kept Iranian forces busy, and they got the airmen out. Just incredible.
2 days later, Trump made this triumphant post. And the rescue was, for sure, a huge success. But it came at a pretty high cost. An A-10 warplane actually crashed during the op. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were hit and other aircraft were damaged. So yeah, it was a victory, but it also really drove home just how real the dangers were for U.S. forces.
Right, so after that dramatic rescue, the whole narrative shifts from military action to this frantic kind of knife-edge diplomacy. A ceasefire gets hammered out, but as you're about to see, it was anything but stable. And get this. It was Pakistan, of all countries, that stepped in to pull everyone back from the brink. They used a direct channel between their army chief and President Trump, and somehow they managed to broker this last-minute 2-week ceasefire agreement. It literally happened right before Trump's final deadline expired. But that peace, it was shattered almost immediately. Within hours of the ceasefire starting, Israel launched massive strikes on Lebanon. Their argument? They weren't part of the deal. So, despite that, peace talks kicked off in Islamabad, but they collapsed after just 21 hours. And immediately after that, Trump escalates again, announcing a full naval blockade of Iran. It was a diplomatic roller coaster that just went completely off the rails.
So why did the talks fail so spectacularly? Well, it all boiled down to one single disagreement. The U.S. was demanding Iran suspend all its nuclear activity for 20 years. Iran's offer, they were only willing to commit to 5.
That's a huge gap, and neither side was willing to budge, so the whole thing just came crashing down.
With diplomacy totally in shambles, the crisis just got even more confusing. It started sending these ripples of uncertainty all across the globe. Let's take a look at the immediate economic and geopolitical fallout.
You want to talk about mixed signals? Check this out. On April 17th, even with the U.S. blockade in place, Iran suddenly announced the Strait of Hormuz was open. Oil prices immediately dropped. But then, just one day later, they did a complete 180, closed the strait again, and even started firing on commercial ships. This just created absolute chaos for global trade.
And countries like India felt the real-world consequences right away. Iranian forces fired on 2 of their ships, which forced a total of 8 Indian vessels to just turn back around. And remember, this is a country that was working pretty closely with Iran just a few months earlier. The whole conflict also forced India to go ask the US for special permission just to buy Russian oil. It just goes to show how quickly these regional fights can mess with global energy security.
Meanwhile, kind of on a separate track, the U.S. did manage to mediate a temporary 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, and that brought a bit of a brief calm to that particular front. But it's really important to remember this was totally separate from the main event, the core U.S.-Iran standoff, which was still completely unresolved.
And that brings us right up to the present moment in our timeline. That original 2-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, the one that started back on April 8th, well, it's set to expire today, April 22nd. The peace talks are dead, the blockade is still in effect, and the clock has officially run out.
So here we are. Nothing's been solved. The ceasefire is over. Those core disagreements are still there. And a naval blockade? Well, that's pretty much an act of war in itself. With the clock at 0, the entire world is once again asking the same terrifying question it was asking back on April 7th. What happens next?